Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss sanctions that the United States has placed on Iran, new sanctions, at this time targeting officials which it says have carried out human rights violations in the country. This all in the context of those protests that took place in Iran right after fuel prices were increased quite drastically. Now, Iran itself has said that these sanctions are fruitless and repetitive. One of those people who have been sanctioned is the Iranian Interior Minister, as well as, of course, other significant ranking officials as well. What does all of this mean at this point? Does it mean that Iran has genuine human rights issues within its own borders? But then if it does the U.S. already have the place to be the one policing other countries' human rights issues? And then who exactly gets to then police's issues? Will Iran address those concerns as has been outlined even by the likes of Amnesty International and others? Iran, remember, has not even at this point in time released the number of people who were killed in those protests. The numbers range quite drastically between different human rights groups, estimates of around 300, according to, I believe, Amnesty International and others as well at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Yousuf Azizi, who is a researcher at Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs. He's working on his dissertation about U.S. foreign policy decision-making and Iran's nuclear program. He's joining us this morning from Virginia in the U.S. Joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran, is Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a foreign policy expert. Hamidreza and Yousuf, thank you both for your time today. Yousuf, let me start with you. What do you make of these sanctions?
Hello, and thank you for having me. First of all, I would like to say that maximum pressure or any kind of sanction policy has distinctive dimensions, political, diplomatic, and certainly economic itself. So although the maximum pressure has reached its maximum capacity of pressing Iran's economic sector, but in other dimensions has not been able to put heavy pressure on Iran because it is unilaterally imposed by United States. So I think sanctioning Iranian officials does not help Trump administration goal. These kind of sanctions are mostly symbolic and do not cause any extra harm to Iran's economy. Iranian officials always they have welcomed these kind of sanctions by previous administration, this administration, because they don't have any assets or economic or political ties outside Iran. So the United States does not have any capability or capacity to freeze those assets belong to them, nothing outside here. And this specific case, I think Trump administration wanna show that yes, this administration truly cares about the human rights of Iranian people. It might be a kind of correction or revision of this administration's bad behavior toward Iranian ordinary people in past, such as travel ban, known as Muslim ban, which has separated Iranian families and puts lots of pressure on Iranian Americans and Iranian students studying at the American universities. So also we have to consider the recent request from Trump administration by many international organizations, such as United Nations and Amnesty International, to temporarily suspend economic sanctions against Iran during this COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. But we all know that the U.S. refused to do that. Also, we know that U.S. did not permit World Bank and IMF to give a loan to Iran to combat this outbreak. So the international organization reminded everyone that these unilaterally sanctions violated the basic human rights of Iranians, in which Iranians cannot access to special medicine or hospital equipment. So I think this kind of hypocrisy by U.S. government to allege that we are protecting Iranians' human rights. This is the argument I have.
Okay, Hamidreza, let me begin, because one of the things that's standing out right now is everyone disagrees on what the death toll was from those protests about the fuel price hike, right? Why hasn't Iran been transparent about that?
Issue for Iran. It has turned into a security issue, and because of that, officials are very sensitive about it. There has not been an agreement yet to that's actually a request from inside the country as well. But the point is that something that I can understand, I cannot say that it justifies, but I can understand that the concern is that the other countries, especially the United States, want to use it as a bargain chip and to put pressure, more pressure on Iran. on the pretext of those killed people. On the other side, we have Amnesty International report, as you just mentioned, that is just hiding the reality on the ground, that there were some protesters who were armed, and they actually were opening fire on people, and they were barring the roads and such things, and most of the killings were from those sides. Or we have some cities in which police forces and security forces were not armed with weapons, but there were killings showing that it was from inside the protesters. There were some infiltrators who were opening gunfire on the other protesters to make killings among the people, among the protesters, to increase the death tolls. So because of the situation that we have, that is the mindset here among the officials, as far as I can understand, that the release of the data and the release of the information can increase the pressure and can hide the realities, which is actually being hid by mainstream media right now.
Okay, so Yousuf, I think is a challenge then, because we can admit that every country has its issues when it comes to human rights, right? I mean, every one country deals with it in their own respective way. Do you believe that Iran internally has a good system in place to deal with any human rights issues?
That's a good question and good point. I think all of it should belong to Iranian people. Iranian people should decide about that. And also, international organizations, they have the capacity to push Iranian government to be more transparent, to be more responsible, and to be more accountable. But when we encounter with a unilaterally sanctioned and unilaterally action by United States, we all have some kind of questioning of this kind of policy, because we can see the previous U.S. experience, U.S. policy toward these region and also South America. It is not always necessary that United States policy is wide or is in the support of human rights of people. No, it is not. We can see this in Afghanistan. We can see in this Yemen. We can see that in Bahrain. We can see in Syria. So sometimes the United States' interest in the region is completely opposite to the human rights, and they use these human rights policy and tools to intervene to other countries, which mostly has independent policy than United States, independent regional policy than the United States. The United States wanted to intervene to their domestic policy. So I think if the request comes from the international organization, it has some basis and it has some foundation, legal foundation. But when it is completely unilateral by United States, so many people have put some question on that.
That's a good point, isn't it, Reza? Do you think that there's an argument to be made, certainly, about the fact that the U.S. is really quite hypocritical in this case over human rights, considering its sanctions are the ones which hurt Iranians the most when it comes to medicine, supplies, etc.?
Any place to talk about human rights, for sure it is the United States, who has even left the United Nations Human Rights Council. So, and they have a very terrible performance in human rights inside the United States. So they don't have any right to do that. It's totally hypocritical. And as you said, we have sanctions, inhuman sanctions in place against people in Iran, in Venezuela, in many countries. And they are weaponizing dollar and the sanctions against humanity. So they don't have any right to do that. And even the organizations such as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, they are also supported by the United States. And we know about the connections between the American officials or former officials and such organizations. So another point is that Iran doesn't claim that it has a perfect performance in human rights. Any country has its own mistakes, and no one said that it is perfect. But the point is that the standards are, first of all, they are trying actually to impose one-size-fits-all standards for everyone. And they are ignoring that. For example, Iran or Pakistan or Afghanistan, for example, all of them are Islamic republics. And they are following Islamic rules, for example. Or there are other countries with their own regulations, their own standards and such things, and their own concerns. So they are trying to impose the same model and the same standards and regulations to everyone, ignoring the realities on the ground and the values and the beliefs and everything that a country like Iran, for example, has. So because of that, that's the problem actually that Iran has always had with the special reporters that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has actually designated for Iran. So what we need to do is to understand how these issues need to be addressed. Iran has, for example, a human rights commission within the judiciary in which many people are going to there and many issues are being solved there. So, but what they do, the Western media and Western officials, is to ignore the things and the measures that Iran is taking. Every year we have the UPR report in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, and there Iran has reported every year or every 2 years that what measures it has taken, what it has done to solve the problems, and about 80% of the problems are solved every time. But they ignore that part.
Okay, Yousuf, I wanted to ask you about what you think about Hamidreza's point about the Islamic Republic, right? There is certainly, granted, a huge difference, right, between the United States and the way it would view its own citizens' rights versus how Iran and other countries would view their citizens' rights. Do you think that that's a fair argument when it comes to human rights issues? I mean, is there just a difference in culture? And I mean, it can also be argued in some regards, right, that why does the rest of the world always have to follow the Western standard?
So this is a good question. For my point, I would see as the double standard of the United States human rights policy towards the Muslim countries and towards the region. We can see this hypocrisy, this double standard, that they put all of the pressure on Iran and Iranian people and search for very little things in Iran and put in the propaganda in the United States international organization. The Iranian has some bad experience with United States intervention in Iran, like what they did as a coup in 1953 with democratically elected government Mossadegh. So Iranian has some kind of hesitation and some kind of stress when they look at the United States just pushing an Iran human rights issue and avoid other countries, other regional countries in these important issues. I believe that Iran has to improve its internal and all other due processes, all other transparency, all other issues. But when we see the pressure of United States and Iran with sanctioning, with all of these economic pressure on Iran, we can see in studies, in research studies, that it has negative impact on human rights, it has negative impact on government transparency, it has negative impact of overall, the governance, the good governance of a country. Yeah. So one of the most important problem and factors of such protest by Iranian people is because of the sanction. The sanction is the reason of that.
Very well. We'll leave the final point, but we do sincerely appreciate both Yousuf and Hamidreza for their time today and for giving us an understanding about the human rights situation within Iran. We can agree, of course, as I said, that every country has its human rights issues, but is it really the place of the United States to come in and tell the Iranians that, no, you're doing this wrong? Is it cultural differences, as Hamidreza there mentioned? Is that enough of an argument to really say that, okay, the U.S. shouldn't be pointing fingers? Certainly, as Yousuf there said, Iran needs to better its internal processes when it comes to how it deals with human rights issues. Hamidreza there said that on a regular basis, Iran does tell the UN about the progress it has made in that regard, but is it enough? Amnesty International, as I said, has concerns, as do many other human rights groups around the world, about the internal situation in Iran. Do they have an agenda at this point in time? Of course, that's an argument that can be made. But at the same time, does that let the Iranians go in their responsibilities in that regard, separate, of course, from the U.S. issue? Because we can all agree that the U.S. very much has its own human rights issues within its own border. So it's not really in a position of moral authority to be telling the rest of the world what to do when it comes to human rights. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Donald Trump and his policies towards migrants and asylum seekers. There has not been concern within the coronavirus pandemic and the era that we're in right now that the U.S. is increasing deportations at a very fast pace of all asylum seekers, essentially, not really allowing anybody in or anyone to stay. The argument is, of course, that it needs to protect its borders, it needs to protect its citizens from the spread of coronavirus, that it does not know and is unable to, I imagine, test each single person. But then there's also then the argument on the part of human rights groups that, listen, you could be sending these very people back to dangerous places, to persecution. Do you want to put them into that position? What of then the international obligations that the U.S. has in this regard? Let's discuss that further now with Jeffrey Marty, who is a Republican strategist and attorney. He's joining us now from Florida and the USA. Jeffrey, good morning, and thanks for joining us. What do you make of the concerns on the parts of human rights groups about this policy of the Trump administration, especially, again, like I said, within the context of the pandemic?
I can understand their concerns as far as wanting to save people that are unfortunately victims of violence, especially gang violence and destabilization in places like Honduras and Guatemala. But before this happened, we were trying to tamp down on asylum claims just as a matter of policy, trying to discourage people from coming here to file them for reasons that were not particularly related to absolute. As you could probably see in the pictures, I mean, it's a lot of men coming for work and sometimes bringing children and not doing not really using it for the right purpose. It's to basically to come to the United States, enter in illegally, and sometimes apply for asylum. But the majority of the cases are not people that are actually going to get asylum eventually. They're going to be sent back, or they're just going to slip through illegally. So it becomes another tool to use, and the way that it's presented is if though it's for families, but the families are targets of unbelievable abuse on the way through Mexico, and women and girls, they estimate 2/3 plus are sexually assaulted on the way through. So there are a lot of good reasons to discourage this as a practice if the practice is really only for a better life and it's guised under the claim of asylum based upon what people know what to say when they get here.
I wonder, though, the argument about asylum seekers, and especially those who are entering illegally, many people make the argument that they actually fill very important roles within the U.S. economy, right? So they're farm workers, et cetera, a lot of the jobs that possibly the average American would not want to be doing. And considering they also get paid under the table, so they possibly aren't even getting minimum wage in many cases. What do you make of that?
Well, I'd have some personal experience in that area, and that I've seen. So when I was growing up in my early 20s, I saw some people that were hired that were clearly not legal at a business, and they were working and they were actually making more than minimum wage from my understanding of it. They were just hard workers, and they were an asset, obviously, to the economy, and that's a good thing. I mean, we need people. Obviously, I'm in Florida, and there are lots of migrants that come here and they do things like pick strawberries and other hard jobs that many people here wouldn't want to do. Now, at the same time, we're also at the level of nearing a depression as far as the economy is concerned with coronavirus after shutting down and the destabilization that's going to come from naturally flow from a lot of businesses closing. So is that the right time to open the borders? There's a good argument that would say no to that economically, but then also, is it a good time as far as public health is concerned? Because if you have people in roving groups, I mean, we're told to stay 6 feet apart here. We're quarantined. Whole cities and areas are shut down. Los Angeles just announced that Los Angeles County is shutting down for 3 additional months. Yeah. We just don't have the resources to take in people and also to incorporate people who are coming from places that don't have as advanced of a public health system, are congregated in large groups, more likely to spread the coronavirus among themselves, according to our CDC guidelines for what they tell us not to do here. So it's a public health risk in itself, and I think that's justification for suspending asylum at this point. But there are other good arguments as far as I think that work visas would be a good thing if we could get Congress to agree to have a reasonable program on that.
Jeffrey, if I mean, I think that a lot of the arguments you put forth, right, I think they make a lot of sense. And I've said this in previous shows as well, where when we talk about securing any country's border, it makes sense, right? No country wants an open, porous border. You need to know who's entering your country. And certainly those sort of checks and balances make complete sense. But the issue I have is when we have the president, right, and the way he has spoken about asylum seekers or Mexicans, for example, that, this would come up in conversation. It's called Mexicans rapists, et cetera. I mean, that's sort of very derogatory terminology towards those sorts of people. That is just that mindset, right? Which is very troubling, isn't it?
Well, I think some of those comments were taken a little bit out of context, as far as that he meant that people were, that the majority or even a large minority of people were like this. I mean, I think he meant that there is absolute lawlessness on the border. I don't think anyone would argue with that. That the fact that migrants are sexually assaulted on the way through Mexico is something that's very well established. So that's something that the president, I mean, if he's talking about allowing just people, these coyotes and the other people who are conducting these things, to just cross the border at will, and to take advantage of these people, to engage them in human trafficking, to use them as decoys for drug shipments across the border. I mean, the president may have a tone that people can take and say, well, we don't like the comments he makes. But at the same time, it's a human rights issue to allow illegal immigration the way that we allow it. When we allow people to come across the border, they are absolutely used and abused on the way up in horrific ways. And then when they actually get here, I mean, they get their valuables stolen, they're subject to sexual assaults. And then when they actually get to the United States, they don't have much to rely on. And if they slip through, then they get through. And then they may get into the economy, and they may be taken advantage of, or they may be used as, by drug cartels. I mean, there are a whole bunch of bad things that can happen to people as a result of the system that's kind of a nod and a wink as far as immigration is concerned. Now, people have said it nicer. I mean, maybe Barack Obama said it in a nicer way, but he also had the unaccompanied minor crisis, where he had 50,000 plus minors who were intercepted, and he was telling them to go back. He was sending them back as a matter of policy because it overwhelmed their system. So the way he talks, I mean, that's one thing, but it's the practical implications of the policy that matters more, I think.
Okay, so at this time, the concern remains that even children are being sent back. Again, I'm going to repeat and come back full circle to the original argument that many human rights groups are making about how these people may be sent back to dangerous places and dangerous conditions. Do you think that at this point in time, practically speaking, the resources are in place within this pandemic and in this time frame to really go through everybody case by case and make that decision properly? Because at least from the outside, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems from the news articles coming out that this sort of seems to be a flood where every asylum seeker coming in is just being sent back.
I believe that's the case as far as them being sent back in a much more expedited and summary way that compared to before. I mean, in the past they were trying to have people wait in a safe harbor third country like Guatemala or Mexico and apply for asylum that way, and wait somewhere else, because if the danger is in the Northern Triangle countries below Mexico, then when they get to the next country, they could apply there, or they could apply at in Mexico. It's not a guarantee that they even had asylum for domestic violence. If that's domestic violence in the country itself. I mean, we have that here. We have gang violence here. We have all sorts of problems in the United States, especially for people that are undocumented. I mean, sometimes they're targeted much more because people know that they will not go to the police. So it's a difficult line to draw, but the thing is, we have a public health crisis that's taking all of our resources. If we're on the verge of economic collapse, if we don't turn around quickly enough, then to introduce people who are going to require lots and lots of resources that are coming here illegally, this is the wrong time to do that. And I think to a degree, you send a message to the people that are in these countries about how open your border is by enacting tough measures like this. If they know they're going to get sent to Guatemala to wait, they're probably not going to want to do that. And very few actually seek asylum once they get to Guatemala. So it's a tough measure, but at the same time, we had the loosest measures possible for the last two administrations.
Yeah.
So there's no way it requires correction, and President Trump is doing things that are a little bit unorthodox or definitely breaking with the past because we don't have solid immigration reform. I think that's more on Congress than it is on him as far as
all right.
implications of this.
Joe, I want to get one final comment from you, if I may, before letting you go this morning. When it comes to just the image of the U.S., right? When we talk about this sort of thing, and I take all your arguments on board, but the image internationally then becomes that the U.S. is not really respecting its own human rights morals, and the fact that its moral authority is ceding, is going down at this point. What do you make of that? Because that's important, isn't it? Where the U.S. standing, the U.S. image, I imagine, is something important to preserve.
Well, I think it depends on where you get that image from. If you look at the image as coming from having a lawless border where we allow billions of dollars in heroin and methamphetamine to cross the border, and these people are used as decoys and distractions, and we're enabling a system that allows migrants to be assaulted on the way up through Mexico, raped, robbed, and abused, then I don't think that really enhances our standing if it were reported on more accurately, if the whole experience was reported on more accurately. And then when they get here, that we're not really taking care of them either. They're avoiding the court hearings, they're avoiding the border patrols, and they're getting away, and they're slipping into the dark economy for human trafficking and other terrible things. So if you look at the entire picture, the process is not working very well. And I think that's something that maybe is not, the president's comments and his policies are over dramatized, I think, in relation to the problems that we have with the border itself. That has been something that's been going on for many decades. And I think there is a nod and a wink that goes on with people that do want people to come to Florida to pick strawberries and to do other things that illegal immigrants often do. And it's unfortunate because it's not good for them. It's not good for us. The drugs come through the border. The money goes out. The people are treated with absolute abuse. We could come to a solution that's better than this, but it requires Congress and the president to do it together.
Okay, we'll leave that as our final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your time this morning. That was Jeffrey Marty speaking to us there from Trinity, Florida. We've tried to understand, of course, as I've said to Jeffrey as well, we understand certainly that the U.S. has to protect its borders, but then is this the way to go about doing it? I mean, that's what's really up for debate, isn't it, about the treatment of asylum seekers, and if the U.S. is specifically right now within this coronavirus pandemic at a stage where it can, on a case-by-case basis, I should say, look at each of these people and decide whether or not sending them back to their home countries or otherwise would endanger them and their lives and their children's lives possibly as well. That's what's really up for debate right now, right? And also then the international obligations that the U.S. has to protect people in general. And then, as I put to Jeffrey as well, there is that underlying reality that many of these people fulfill jobs that normal Americans probably would not want to fill, and are also then paid under the table dismal amounts of money, really, but then they're happy to take it on because it's probably possibly more than, I should say, actually, what they may make in their home countries. Nevertheless, they are abused, as Jeffrey there said, sexually and otherwise. They're exploited in many ways on their way to the U.S. and even many times within the U.S. itself. So all of the above creates a complex situation, but certainly it can be dealt with in a better fashion if, as Jeffrey said, Congress and the White House were to work together on this instead of just bickering in a partisan fashion. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UK's terror legislation, which has raised concerns in many regards when it comes to human rights, even of those who are suspected of terrorist acts and are not yet convicted of them. Because there's now talk of extending essentially the 2-year limit that applies to the standard of proof to impose orders such as TPMs, as they're called, which essentially restricts the movements of many of these suspected terrorists within the country. There's now talk of having ankle bracelets indefinitely. A lot of these sorts of things impinge on one's human rights and freedoms, don't they? Especially considering you haven't yet been convicted necessarily of a crime, be it terrorist in nature or otherwise. Let me put that now to our guest who is joining us to discuss this further. We're now joined by Stephen Greer, who is a professor of human rights at the University of Bristol Law School. He's joining us now from Bristol. Stephen, thank you for your time today. What do you make of essentially now the indefinite extension of this law in the way it's being designed?
Well, I think that's the most unfortunate feature of it. I would like to begin by saying, though, that there is a distinction between restricting human rights, which is permissible if it's justified and proportionate, and violating human rights, which isn't justified under any circumstances. And the TPIMs and the control orders regime that you referred to earlier have been tested by the courts and have been found to be compliant with human rights. They restrict human rights, provided they're necessary and proportionate, and they observe they're not excessive in the restrictions they impose upon movement. I think the extension of this, the lifting of the 2-year ban, probably pushes it into disproportionate territory, but that could be changed as the legislation progresses through Parliament. And even if it's not, it'll be open to judicial challenge.
I wonder, Stephen, this is a delicate topic, isn't it? Because when it comes to suspected terrorists especially, I imagine the public would be a lot more willing to give room, right, to law enforcement to do as they think best. Do you think that sort of lack of public pressure possibly is giving law enforcement a lot more of a freer hand in this regard?
Well, yeah, I think it is, but I'm not persuaded that we're entering a police state or any of those kind of complaints that have been made. The thing about it is that the TPIMS regime only applies to about 30 suspects at the moment. The restrictions are upon various freedoms of movement, for example, a nighttime curfew and restrictions upon association, etc. Those are going to be extended to things like compulsory drug testing, accounting for electronic devices in the household. These are not hugely draconian impositions, in my view. But the problem is the indefinite extension, the possible indefinite extension of these. And like I say, I think if that was tested before the courts, it would probably not survive.
Stephen, when it comes to any crime, it has to be proven, right, in a court of law, and or the person is let go. So why can't that just be the case in this regard? Have a trial, present the evidence, and if the jury or judge, however that system works out, finds a person guilty, then they're guilty. If not, then not.
The problem here is, and successive governments in this country have recognized it, is that there are some people who are at large who present a threat to public safety and national security, with respect to whom there isn't sufficient information to put them on trial. And the dilemma is, do you just let them run free? Do you put them under surveillance? Do you put them under some kind of controlled regime? Or what do you do with them? And the solution that's been arrived at is it's an uncomfortable, I suppose, or a balance that's not wholly satisfactory, is that if you've got intelligence that suggests that there are certain people that pose these threats, you place restrictions upon their movement and you subject them to surveillance in the hope that will keep them under some kind of control. As I said before, this is perfectly consistent with human rights as long as it's proportionate and necessary. It's been tested by that proposition that you can put people under various forms of restraint, house arrest included, without a criminal trial, has been tested by the courts in this country and the European Court of Human Rights, and has been found to be compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights.
As a final point before I let you go, Stephen, do you think that this will be applied across the board to all forms of terrorism, all concerns about terrorism? Because as you well know, the far-right extremism is something which slowly the Europeans, as well as, of course, the Americans and even Canadians have woken up to as a real threat. Do you think, for example, I mean, we just had Paul Golding, right, of Britain First, being arrested on a terror offense. Do you think that these sorts of restrictions would extend to even somebody within those circles who is a danger, but their crimes, for example, cannot be proven at this point?
Yeah, yes, I think it should, of course, and I think it will if there is evidence. What we've also seen, of course, is that the PREVENT program, which is also very controversial on human rights grounds, but I think is one that can be defended, has increasingly been used against the far right. Indeed, the referrals to PREVENT prior to the coronavirus outbreak were almost equal to those for jihadi terrorism. So yes, it is perfectly possible, indeed I would say likely, that with the extension of the TPIM's regime, we will see it being extended to other forms of terrorism.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But Stephen, we do really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us here in Scope. That was Stephen Greer speaking to us there from Bristol. Now, of course, when it comes to this terror legislation, the concern is on the human rights level. Stephen, they're saying that this isn't actually against people's human rights if it's not, of course, extended indefinitely. Now, to have an indefinite period of time where you're going to be having ankle bracelets on or you're going to have restrictions on your movement is something which, of course, does impede your freedoms and human rights. However, if there is a real concern, if there's real evidence that you may very well be a threat to society, be you a far-right extremist or otherwise, then it makes sense for you to have restrictions on your movement. I mean, that's a debate which, of course, needs to happen openly, as it is seemingly happening in the UK, although everyone's distracted right now by the coronavirus pandemic. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.